Hello, my name is Steve Coleman. I'm the soil fertility specialist at Ohio State, and I'm going to talk to you about a project that has been a pretty major undertaking. Over the last 6, 7 years, we've been working to revise the Tri-State Fertilizer recommendations. And so this real quick video is just going to kind of go over some of the main pieces here. And a lot of this work built over a number of years of on-farm trials that we conducted across the state. Again, it was a major effort. We relied heavily on OSU extension educators, some private crop consultants, co-ops, etc. We focused on corn, soybeans, and wheat. We looked at nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and did a little bit of sulfur work. The whole goal was to try to capture many different soil types and diversities across the state. We had fields that had history of manure versus not, history with no-till versus not, cover crop not. So we captured quite a bit of different management practice and soil types. We worked directly with growers, crop consultants, educators, etc. And the trials varied a little bit depending on the crop and the nutrient, but for the most part, we sampled everything pre-fertilization at a 0 to 8 inch depth. We took leaf and tissue grain nutrient concentrations. We measured grain yield to see if there was a response to that fertilizer, and then we captured all of the details of that site or that field with a management survey. And so I'm going to start really just with highlighting some of the major changes. So our core nitrogen rate recommendations have been updated. P and K fertilizer recommendations have had tweaking and some modification, but largely remain consistent or unchanged with the 1995 version, okay, so the original Tri-States. Malic 3 is now the default soil test extractant for phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium. We used to, the original recommendations were based on Bray phosphorus and ammonium acetate for potassium, and so now it's more consistent with industry practice, okay? Critical P levels for all crops really remain unchanged, except now that they are reported in this Malic 3 extractant. And critical K levels are simplified into two CEC classes. That is sandy soils versus everything else, silt and clay loams, okay? And so that's a bit of a change. We'll talk about all this in just a little bit here. Nutrient removal rates per bushel have decreased, especially with potassium, and that has implications for fertilizer recommendations. So what hasn't changed or what's consistent with that, the original version of 1995? Our soil sampling recommendations really haven't changed. Our lime recommendations are the same. Sulfur, calcium, magnesium, and micronutrient recommendations, we have not seen any real reason to modify these, okay? Soil sampling strategies, okay, so we really can't overemphasize that a good nutrient recommendation starts with taking quality soil samples, okay? And so this means that soil samples should be collected consistently every time, typically every 3 to 4 years, and samples should represent no less than 25 acres, okay? So we typically like to see soil samples that are much smaller than that, say 10 acres or even 2.5 acres, for example, but 25 would be the max. And there's really no major changes to our lime rec. Going to jump into core nitrogen rates, and this is a unified, back in the early 2000s, all the Corn Belt states, or not all of them, but many of them, as highlighted here, went to more of an economic model. And so there's a lot to be said about this. Again, for the purposes of this video, we're just going to keep things short. And it's really consistent across this Corn Belt region. All of the recommendations for those states are based on trials conducted within each state, okay? And so the whole idea is that if we want to fertilize, to try to maximize yield or maximize based on our yield goals, there's a lot of challenges with that with nitrogen. And so rather than that approach, we try to focus on maximizing profitability, not the actual bushels per acre, but actually maximizing profitability. And this is what we're calling a maximum return to nitrogen, or MRTN. You might have heard that before. Each state has its own recommendations from trials conducted within the state. As I said, it's a simple tool. It's a starting point for nitrogen recommendations. So it requires very little inputs. It requires what you're paying for nitrogen fertilizer, what you expect for, what you expect to see in terms of your dollars per bushel, and then it provides some simple calculations. So this website that you see kind of grayed out here is you can go through go.osu.edu corn-n-rate, so you can find it that way. Or if you don't even want to go there, here's just really a table for corn following soybeans. This is based on 228 trials, different nitrogen rates collected across the state of Ohio. A tremendous amount of work to get this information. And you can see that, when nitrogen prices are high and corn prices are really low, we recommend a pretty low fertilizer rate, 155 pounds per acre. But when fertilizer prices are low and corn prices are high, that rate increases dramatically to 200 pounds per acre. So again, this is an economic model intended to maximize profitability based on the price of fertilizer and the price of corn. And really for Ohio, following soybeans, it ranges from 155 to 200 pounds per acre, okay? So if you ask what's the right rate, well, that's going to depend on the price that you're paying and the price that you're receiving, okay? Moving on to potassium and phosphorus. This remains unchanged in the context that we use soil test levels, that is soil test phosphorus, soil test potassium, to make our recommendations. And there's really these three phases. There's an efficient phase, an optimal, and a sufficient. And depending on those phases, those dictate when you should apply fertilizer and how much. So when it's in the deficient phase or below that critical level, we're applying crop removal plus fertilizer, to some additional fertilizer to build soil test level up. And we say do this immediately before you actually grow another crop, right? Or before you plant another crop. When it's in this optimal range, which we also call the maintenance range, essentially our fertilizer rate approximates crop removal. So if we're pulling off, say, 60 pounds of P2O5, that's essentially our fertilizer rate. We do not expect, when we're in the optimal level, if we fertilize, we're going to see a crop response to fertilizer. We're not going to see a yield response, but we fertilize essentially to maintain that soil test level and replace what we're removing with harvest, okay? And when we're in that optimal level, it gives us some flexibility. So it's not fertilized immediately, but it's fertilized sometime within that rotation. And when we're above the maintenance limit or at sufficiency, there's no need to fertilize, okay? So very simply, our recommendations, they've been tweaked and, again, moved to this Malic 3 extractant. But for phosphorus, it's 20 to 40 part per million. Malic 3 phosphorus is our kind of optimal level, or what we recommend that you keep soil test levels for corn and soybeans. For wheat and alfalfa, it's higher because they do have a higher requirement. We did acknowledge that, or did confirm that in our trials, 30 to 50 part per million, okay? So with corn and soybeans, if you have wheat in the rotation, you can choose to keep it at 30 to 50, or you can keep it maybe a little bit lower and apply some fertilizer, some phosphorus fertilizer when you plant wheat. For Malic 3, again, it's instead of based on the critical level, the critical level is based on CECs. We really just split things into sandy soils versus kind of everything else. So sandies versus loams, silt loams, clay loams. And here, the recommendations, for sandy soils, it's 100 to 130 Malic part per million. And for loams and clays, it's 120 to 170. So these are the levels that we recommend that you keep your soils at. For all these trials, we measured grain nutrient removal rates. So, for example, if you pull off a bushel of corn from a field, there's nutrients in that corn, of course, and that's really what when we're in the maintenance range, when we're in that optimal level, that's what our fertilizer rates are based on. Okay, so we can see that the old, quote unquote, old 1995 recommendations here are what they stated in terms of pounds per bushel. So for corn, every bushel, there's 0.37 pounds of P2O5 per bushel. Our new data, 0.35, so it represents a 5% decrease from before. And here you can see across the board with corn, soybeans, and wheat, our grain nutrient concentrations are actually decreasing as yields have increased with plant breeding. Essentially, the crops are, there's presumably more starch, more carbohydrate in that crop relative to nutrient, and we can see that our nutrients are decreasing in that grain. It's particularly pronounced with potassium. We can see, phosphorus are some modest changes, but with potassium, much larger changes, 26, 19, and 35% for corn, soybeans, and wheat. Okay. This has, depending on how you look at this, this has also been found in other states in recent updates. This is an opportunity to save in fertilizer costs in terms of what we're replacing, what we're fertilizing versus what we're removing, okay? So there's a lot to be said about this. Again, there's more information at this go link here if you're curious. And then secondary nutrients and micronutrients. Sulfur, sulfur is a really big and topic right now. There's a lot of people talking about sulfur. We've not found major, we've actually looked quite a bit at this point, but we have not found major deficiencies with sulfur. So we are going to continue to monitor, but at the time, we just don't see a lot of fields that are very responsive to sulfur. Calcium and magnesium are the same. Micronutrients, of course, deficiencies do exist, but they are not widespread, and they're often patchy in fields. And so we make recommendations based on those. So in general, soils in the tri-state region in Ohio typically supply sufficient nutrients of these secondary micronutrients, but there are, of course, special cases that require fertilization. So again, here's to summarize our major changes. Corn N rates are updated. P and K fertilizer recommendations are largely unchanged. There has been some tweaking, but they're pretty consistent with what they have been in the past. Nutrient removal rates per bushel have decreased, particularly with potassium, and that represents an opportunity to save in fertilizer costs for growers. And I'll just say, again, this is a very quick tour here. There's plenty more information at this website, go.osu.edu-fertrecs. There's a lot of people here. I mean, my main co-authors, but there's been many farmers to thank about this. A huge effort, and of course, could not have been made possible without checkoff dollars. So, your checkoff dollars at work, Ohio Soybean Council, and Corn and Wheat Checkoff. So, I'll end there, and thanks for your time.